Today we're going to continue studying about the melacha, the creative processes that are required to make food. In Shabbat Made Simple, Part 4. We already began the process of going from this wild prairie grass to a basic human need, which is bread. We're going to continue this process in the Melachot of Food, Part 2. We began with a field of prairie grass, and we made it in our past video all the way up to this handful of usable wheat berries. That was all covered in steps number 1 through 7. Each one of those steps is referred to as a melacha, as a creative action that takes us from God's beautiful world to our basic human necessities. Today we're going to go from this handful of grain to this delicious loaf of bread in steps number 8 through 11. Let's review quickly steps number 1 through 7. First, we have that beautiful field that you saw. We need to plow the field in order to prepare it for step number 2, which is of course planting. Putting out the seeds on the field. Now you can imagine these seeds are growing. They become a beautiful field of golden wheat. At that point, we need to do step number 3, which is harvesting the wheat. Now you can imagine a complete field of harvested wheat, but the wheat is all laying on the ground. So we have to go to step number 4, which is gathering the wheat. Once the wheat is gathered, it's in big sheaves that once again are placed all over the field. We need to take those sheaves of wheat and extract the usable wheat berries. The first step in that process is smashing the wheat so that the wheat berries become separate, and that we refer to as threshing. Once they're smashed, we need to separate the wheat berries from all of the garbage, which is referred to as chaff. And that we do by throwing the wheat up in the air and allowing the chaff, which is light, to blow by the wind into a separate pile, and the wheat berries, which are heavy, to fall down into their own pile, and that is referred to as winnowing. The 7th step, we're going to then take and separate by hand all of the garbage that's left in this pile of usable wheat, which is referred to as separating. So those are the first 7 steps: plowing, planting, harvesting, gathering, threshing, winnowing, and separating. For more details on those steps, please see the previous video. Now we're going to go from these wheat berries to our next product, which is of course flour. In order to do that, we need to grind the wheat berries in our 8th step, which is called grinding. Now of course in the olden days, the old way of grinding is using 2 stones that have grooves in them, and by spinning them around on top of each other with the wheat berries in between them, the flour comes out through the grooves and is collected in this area right here. Today, we use large machines. Now you and I may not plan on grinding flour anytime soon. However, there are things that we do in our modern kitchens. There are things we do in our modern kitchens on a regular basis that are similar to grinding, where we take something which is large in its natural state and make it much, much smaller into its usable state, particularly for food. One example of that might be pressing garlic. Okay, now this flour that we have is actually very refined. There's one step that we missed that is required in order to make this flour so beautiful and white, and that would be sifting. We need to take the flour and ensure that any imperfections, any stones, or any leftover chaff, or anything of that sort is not going to be included in this flour. And we do that by sifting. In the olden days, they would use a hand sifter. Today, again, we use machines, but the process is still the same. All of these processes have remained exactly the same over all these thousands of years. Now, once again, you or I may not be bakers, and we may not sift flour on a regular basis. However, there are things in our life that are similar to sifting, where you pour a bunch of good stuff on top of something, which is going to leave the bad stuff still in that something, and the good stuff is going to fall to the bottom. One example of that may be straining a liquid. So now we have our sifted flour. We need to get to our next product, which is of course dough. The way that we make flour into dough is by adding a liquid, typically water, and mixing it together. That is referred to as kneading, the 10th step in our journey. In the olden days, typically people would knead by hand. Even today, there are many people who like to make their breads and similar types of foods by using their hands. However, once again, we have large machines that can make this process easier. But Shabbat has nothing to do with easy or hard. It has everything to do with creating. Now again, you or I may not be bakers, and we may not bake regularly in our homes. So what would we have that's similar to kneading? Well, any time that you take a powder and you mix it together with a liquid in order to make something which is more solid or has a much firmer consistency, that would be similar to kneading. One example might be making pudding. So now we have dough. We need to take this dough and make it into our final product in the last step, which is, of course, baking. In the olden days, they used very primitive ovens in order to bake. Today, we have much more modern ovens, but the process is still exactly the same. We use heat in order to change our ingredients to become a final product. Now, even if you're not a baker, and even if you don't bake at home, anything that uses heat in order to change raw ingredients to its final product would be considered similar to baking. And in order to introduce this idea, I'm going to bring the star of our show to point out that any type of cooking or anything that is similar to cooking is considered similar to baking. In conclusion, there are 11 steps or specific processes that allow us to go from a field, the way it is found in nature, to a final product of delicious bread. And each one of these steps are considered a melacha, a creative action. It has nothing to do with how difficult or how easy it is to do. Instead, it has everything to do with taking God's beautiful creation and converting it and transforming it into our basic needs. And each one of these steps, whether they're taken alone or whether they're part of one long process, and even if they are not really part of cooking, but they're just something similar to one of these steps, is considered a creative process and therefore should not be done on Shabbat. We use our Shabbat instead of transforming God's creation to appreciating God's creation. At this point, I'd like to wish you and your loved ones a Shabbat Shalom.